Hi designers, in this video I'm going to show you how to render objects in Illustrator. We'll use gradient tools, shape layers, and stroke weights to give your objects a photorealistic look. Then we'll bring the composite shape into Photoshop and give it a background and kind of reflection and tabletop just to set the scene. The background will be helpful if any of you have transparencies in your object, like glass or plastic. What I have rendered here is just kind of an opaque matte plastic with some glossy accents up here and some text that has a slight drop shadow on it to make it look three-dimensional. So let's get started. I have in here my Illustrator line work that I have from the last video. I'll just go ahead and reset this so we can start from scratch. So here's that line work. Everything is just black and white, or I have a transparent fill. So I'm just seeing the line work and I have some varied strokes. So what we want to do to get started is to create a new layer. And I'll just call this rendering. And the first thing that I'm going to do is just copy all of my line work into the new layer. To make sure that it stays in place, I go to Edit, Paste in Place, and I can hide and lock my old line work layer. So I just have everything duplicated on this rendering tab. So as I'm working, what I'm shooting for is closed shapes. So what you'll get good at is holding Alt and sliding, and Shift as well, Alt and Shift. So Alt duplicates an object as you drag, and Shift ensures that it snaps to the horizontal or the vertical. So you'll get really good at sliding either up and down and keeping everything in these like Cartesian paths. Make sure that we can get everything lined up again when we bring it back over our object. So what we'll do is we'll work on the silhouette first, compile that, and then bring that back to our object, and then work on the internal details after that. So as you noticed from the Photoshop file, we don't have black line work, and that helps with the realism. So what I'll do with my kind of object selection arrow over here is I'll just go ahead and I'll flip that to take the stroke away and shift that fill color back to the inside. But I don't want black, I want to have some kind of base color. So in my sample, I had this kind of magenta color. So you can pick from a swatch up here, or you can double click on that color to see a color picker. I like using HSB, H for hue, S for saturation, B for brightness. So this is kind of like the black and white level. So seeing this color picker allows you to move within here. And I'm going to pick a kind of nice magenta color. You can see the new versus the old. You can use the slider to control that intensity of saturation and brightness. So you can see some of these values in here. So I'll hit OK. Feel free to tweak this a little bit, and take the time to make sure it's something that you like, because you will be working with it for a while. Granted, it's Illustrator, so you can go back and change anything as you need to. All right, so that's going to be my base color, and I like that. I'm going to keep that 100% opacity, though you can vary it a little bit if you so choose. But I'm going to leave it 100%. Okay, now I need to shade it. So I'll go back over here. And you can work either using the gradient tool, or you can choose a preset from your swatches up here. So in the first column, fourth one down, there's a gradient going from white to black. And that's just the default. So that's pretty handy to choose, but we want a lot more nuance than this. So you'll go to your gradient tool over here. There's also a gradient window for fine tuning that you can turn on from your Windows tab. So we'll look at that. And right now I just have two stops. So what that means is I have white on one end, black on the other. But as you might recall, objects have um, more than just two stops, right? There's kind of backlighting, there's shadow cores. So what you want to do is add enough of these stops where you can kind of control what the lighting on your object is going to be. So you can control that with opacity if you just use black and white. If you go over here in the color tab, you can assign colors for your stops here. So this might be helpful. You can also control the variance in the stops there, like how wide this is. So for my highlight over here, I want that to be a little softer because I want this to look matte. And for my shadow, same kind of thing. That's looking a little strong, so maybe I'll take the opacity down a little bit. And we'll see how that looks. So this is a linear gradient, which is a bit limited for this exercise. Ideally, we could have a little bit of contour on this. But I think this is going to get the point across and it'll look good enough. We'll do some fine tuning using the multi-point gradient in a little bit. So I'm going to drag this back over and you can see where I've adjusted the opacity. I can kind of see the magenta behind it, but to better blend it into the object, I'm going to control the master opacity up here, and that controls the entire object. So you can see that this gives a little bit of a contour. You can fine tune it by going back to edit gradient, and maybe I want to remove this stop. Maybe it's not doing as a service to the concept. Maybe I want a little bit more of a soft gradient in there. And I think that looks pretty good. Maybe we could get a little bit darker with this stop. All right, I like that. I think that's looking pretty good. Okay, so there's another gradient tool that we can use. So I'm going to just make a copy of this, right? I still have it over here. I just made another copy. And over here, I can edit the gradient even further. So we did linear gradient. There's a radial gradient, which we'll use later, and then a multi-point gradient over here that gives you points that you can control, right? So it's added 3 points here, and it does a little analysis to try to figure out what we want. But maybe I want to suggest a little bit more of a highlight towards the top there and shadow towards the bottom. Maybe I remove that stop. And you can control how, how soft this transition is by grabbing that stopper. So you can see how that affects the transition from one to the other. That's quite dramatic, right? So smaller is going to be a softer influence. So this is kind of nice. So for curved objects, you can kind of compensate a little bit for some of the curvature using this multi-point gradient tool. You can also add a stop just by clicking anywhere in that object, but I think I like that. And I can drag that back over here to see what effect that has. Again, controlling the master opacity to try to blend it together. And I think that looks pretty good. I think that suggests a little bit more of the curvature that I wanted. It doesn't look quite so linear. All right, so that looks good. Now I can start to do some of the details, like the top or the bottom. So maybe I want to suggest that there's a little bit of a radius at the bottom. So I'll add another gradient, but I want it only to be localized at the bottom. So I can use my minus front tool in Pathfinder, basically just to crop out what I don't want. So I brought that shape over from here, the rectangle marquee on the side there. So I'm just going to highlight both of these, and in the Pathfinder window, I'll hit minus front. It still retains that multi-point gradient from before, so I'll just reset it to a linear gradient over here. Edit my gradient, you can see how that comes up. But I want it to be black at the bottom, so I'm going to hit 90 degrees. Black is on top, so I want to flip it. There we go. So I have black to white. Now the problem is if I bring this over, I'm going to see white, which I don't want. I want it to be black over here. So what I'll do, let me zoom in here just so we can see it a little bit better. Instead of white over here, I go to my color tab and I hit black. So now I'm 100% black to 100% black. So that should look fully black, which it does. And for the top point, this one here, I'm just going to take that opacity down to 0. And you can kind of see in the slider here, it goes from black to a transparent over here. So that's great. That's what we want. And I want this to be a little bit more pronounced than we see. So I'm going to take the opacity and bring it up. All right, this looks like it got slightly rotated. Not quite sure how or when, but we just fixed that to get that back into place. And there we go. We've got a bit of a gradient on the bottom. Nice. We can do the same thing on the top if we want. So one more time, I grab the layer. I'm holding Alt and Shift to drag it over. M on the keyboard to use that marquee. And minus front in the Pathfinder window. To crop just the top there. Again, we go to our fill color. I'll pick that black and white linear gradient from the side. Edit gradient so I can see my stops. And now I want it to go from white with 100% opacity to white with 0% opacity. So I go here, white, 0. Now I can see it transitioning from white to transparent, and I'll go 90 degrees. Now this is a little hard to see because it's on a black background. I think I want to flip it one more time because I want it to go from white to transparent. So let's see how that looks. Subtle, so we can change the opacity a little bit. And that might suggest a little bit more of a highlight towards the top. Right? Now we're getting something that looks a little bit more shaded, a little bit more rendered. So that looks good. You could group these together so that they move in unison. So I'm going to do that and then drag that back over to my line work. Now I want to send this to the back so that I can click on some of my other line work. So what I'll do is go Object, Arrange, Send to Back. And now I can start working on some of these other areas. So I have my silhouette, I have these features. So maybe I'll start working on these grooves in here. So I can hold Shift and grab those two lines, but I'm also going to need my silhouette because, as you can see, these are individual line segments. So to make this shape, right, these four sides or these four sides, I need to click that, hold Shift, click that, hold Shift, and click again the silhouette of my line work. Okay. So now I can separate the parts that I need of my silhouette. See, click on that by using C on the keyboard for the scissors tool, or over here in the toolbar. So that's right there, right? It might be hidden under eraser, but it's scissors right there. Okay. So I want to make sure that this is highlighted and find that anchor point. And you can trim away what we don't need. So I'll do that again up here. All right. Now I'll go to the white arrow over here, the anchor point selection tool over here, and I'll join those together. So I'm just hitting Control J on the keyboard, or you can get there from Object, Path, and Join. Object, Path, and Join. And we should be able now to make that its own shape layer. And so I can bring that back over here. Now you can manipulate this in several ways. You can give it a color, you can use the gradient tool, right? So you can do that going from, right now it's showing up white down here to transparent up here. So you could potentially do that. You could make it go this way too. You could give it an angle. So if we see what that looks like, just setting it to 45, you could probably make something that looks quite attractive this way. But I want to show you guys a different tool. So I'm just going to hit Control Z to undo that. Go back to black. I want to show you guys another set of tools. If you go to Effect, Stylize, and this is in the Illustrator effects. Note there are Photoshop effects that also has Stylize, just to make it confusing. But in Illustrator effects, if you go to Stylize, there's a few things that I want you guys to become familiar with. So drop shadow, which works just like in Canva or PowerPoint, pretty self-explanatory. Feather, we'll turn on that just to see what that looks like. Feather blurs out the edge of an object, and you can control when and how gradual that blur is. So if you did want a darker core in the middle of this element, maybe showing that it kind of like scoops in a little bit, that would be good, and you can kind of blend that in with the opacity. That looks pretty good. I think what I want is the opposite, so we're going to use the next tool for that. If you go to your kind of tab over here, you can see Appearance. You can see which effects you've added over here. So we see that feather. So if you click on that, you can control that. You can also delete an effect by using the trash can over there. So I'm going to go back over here. I'm going to use the next one in the list, Inner Glow. So this is kind of like feather in that you can control the transition of where that kicks in. You can blend it with a color, and I'm not seeing it true right now because I have this on multiply. So I'll go back to normal. This is the default. Effect, Stylize, Inner Glow. So you can see that that creates this white core that is blending with my outer color, my black color, my base color. So that's creating an inner glow of a particular color. And we can control that blur with how many points. So this is kind of cool. Like I can use that black shadow to show that there's this kind of crisp transition, which I think will look quite nice. 75% is fine. This doesn't look all that good because white is really strong. So what I want to do is go to my transparency tab up here, or window transparency. Cool. And instead of normal, I want to multiply this. That blends, right? We're seeing multiple layers. So it blends that element in. So this gives you a lot of power for adjusting some layers. Right, so I'll do the same thing over here. I'll just move that over to the side so I can grab these. Move that further over. Use C on the keyboard, cut for that. Cut again over there. Cut over there. And cut over there. All right, so I have my shape. Go to my white arrow over there. Join, so I'm hitting Control J, Command J on Mac. And then same operation here. I'll switch that because I don't want the stroke. And slide that back over here. And I can now layer this one back over. And then I'll do the same operation here. Illustrator actually remembers what I've done last, apply inner glow. So let's see if I can do that again. So that looks good, right? But the white is really strong because I have this on a normal layer style. So I'll go to multiply, and those two should look that identical, right? Like they have identical treatments. Okay, so at this point, we're done using these lines, so I can delete these to get rid of that. And that looks good. I can zoom out, assess how things are looking. I can control the opacity. I guess I have to do them individually. All right, if I thought that this looked a little too strong, I can make it more subtle. And that looks like that blends in nicely. Okay, so let's continue working on this. So this area up here, I don't need my darkened stroke, so I'll go ahead and I'll get rid of that. But I want to work on this area up here. So I'm going to take these elements. So I have these 4 sections here. And I'm also going to add the silhouette because I'm going to need that for some of this as well. So I grab those, holding Shift, and now Alt to drag and copy. So I'll bring that over here into my working area. And I want to make sure that these elements are joined. Right now they are not. What you'll see, some of you might get this. What it's doing is it's trying to fill this shape, but it only goes from one anchor point to the other. It's not joined across the top. So I need to join there. And you can see I'm still missing this top portion because I haven't joined it with this silhouette. So I'll just take these, drag it over. Cut there. Cut there. You should see on the cursor that intersect prompt. And there we go. Now I have a layer that's that shape. So I'll delete that one. And then this one, same thing. Delete what I don't need. Join that, join that, join that. Check our work. All right, that looks good. I'll just make this white for the time being. Okay, So we have that scoop and that shape up there. I can delete these. I want to make sure that this is aligned, so I'm going to turn my line work layer on, which is where I have my guide, and draw that back over the guide, and then I can turn that off again. All right, so that's in place, except it's not quite the colors that I want. I can use the gradient again for this. So maybe I want a darker shadow to show that it's scooping in there. So I'll go from my drop down here. For some reason I couldn't access it over here, so I'm gonna go over here to the color tab and find that gradient again. So window gradients for the finer controls. So I've got white to black over here. I want black on the bottom. So I'll switch that. Going up like that. Instead of changing white over here, which is what I showed you guys to do earlier, I can also just change the layer style too. So if I go to my transparency over here, I go to multiply. And what that does is it stacks these layers over each other. So the white isn't shown. It basically just darkens the layers that I'm seeing through. So if I go to multiply, I'm only seeing the darker values, which is what I really want anyway. And I can control the opacity there. I can also control the transition. So I want a little bit more darkness over here underneath this cap. So I think that looks pretty good. As for this up here, this is a little bit tricky because I want this to show what this color was underneath. So what I need to do actually is to create a clipping mask. So I'm going to take this and take this, hold Alt to drag it over. And I have this shape up here, which is what I want this color. I want to basically insert this color in here. So I I select these two things. I go to Object, Clipping Mask, and Make. And it's actually saved that information. You can actually kind of see it show up there, and it's just hidden it behind that top shape. So I can get rid of that, bring this back over, and there we go. When I get rid of my line work, you can see what that looks like, and that looks pretty good. All right, next up, this section over here. So as you might expect, drag it over just for us to work on. And I don't recall if I joined this yet. Looks like that's connected, but these two halves are not connected. So I'll join those, flip it to check our work. And that looks good. Looks like a continuous closed shape. And I'll add a gradient to this. Goes from white to black. If I want this to look shinier, I'm going to need more stops. So I can maybe suggest a brighter highlight in this area. I'm going to hit Edit Gradient to bring up that toolbar there. And in this case, I might want the transitions to be a little bit closer together. Maybe this one can be black. Maybe another one over here can be white again. All right, that looks pretty good. And I want it to be like a bright chrome, so I don't have a texture on it. I think that'll look pretty good. And I can delete my line work. Actually, not so fast. I might want to keep that line work to show a part break. Kind of like how that's looking. So at this stage, I think I'm finished with my silhouette. So I'm going to delete that just to see what we're working with. And I think I want to manipulate this line work a little bit to help show the part break. So I'm going to drag that over to the side. I'll go this way this time. And I don't like that these lines overhang the outside of the silhouette. So I want to show you guys that you can actually do a gradient on a stroke as well. So I'm just going to join these, and do a stroke gradient. So over here, undo that. Over here, you can switch back and forth between doing fill layer and stroke. Up to now, we've just done fill layer. But you may want a gradient on the stroke. So why would you want that? Well, it might be nice to show that your line is thicker or darker in a particular space, or transparent in other spaces, which is what we want. We want to show this kind of darker shadow here, but we don't want this to show up on the outside. You also might want to highlight. You may want to show a highlight is thicker or stronger in a particular area. So let's try that. So over here, I want a radial gradient here. And this is a lot of stops. It kept some of that information from before. So let's remove some of these stops. I want one white one and then one black one. Now, radial gradient, you'll see that preview up here. It's a little bit different than the linear gradient going from side to side. For radial gradient, one stop is the middle, and then one stop is the outside. So we actually want to flip this, boom, because we want black in the middle and then white on the outside, or transparent on the outside. So we can set that to be transparent, go black and 0. And now it'll go from black to transparent on the outside. So that looks pretty good. We can bring that back over our object. Snap that in the middle. Maybe give that an even thicker line and control that transition. And we'll bring this back in. That looks pretty nice. We can do the same thing over here. So for this shape, maybe we want a white highlight to be over here on the bottom. So I'll go to my gradient tool. I'll hit the stroke over there. I'll go actually a linear gradient because I want it to pick up at the bottom and fade out towards the top. So I'll go linear gradient. I'll have white at 0. And let's see where that's showing up. I guess on the stroke, it doesn't give us the that tool. Oh, this is on multiply. That's right. Okay, so that's why that's not showing up. So I'll hit undo. Make this go back to transparent. There we go, transparent. And I'll just duplicate that shape over here and I'll be able to see this a lot better now. So I don't want to fill. Let's start with just a white stroke. All right, that looks good. Let's make this 100% opacity for now. And then on our stroke layer, let's do a linear gradient. And we can actually use screen for this. So instead of making this transparent, we can go to our layer style, screen or lighten. So that'll keep the brightest value. It's kind of the opposite of multiply. And we want white at the bottom. All right, great. Let's see. I still see some of that towards the top. So maybe the better path instead of screen is to just go normal, white, and 0%. That looks a lot better. Okay, we can control the thickness of that highlight and control the opacity. All right, that looks pretty good. Now let's last do the text. So here, this is kind of a thin text, which might be fine for doing like pad printing or like printed labels. If you want to mold it into the container, either to kind of show that it's bossed out or bossed in, maybe pick a bolder treatment. So I'll just go bold there. And black is quite dark. I actually want to sample some of this body color. So make sure you're on the fill color there. So instead of black, I'm going to hit the eyedropper. And if I just click, then it's going to take the treatment of the layer. So gradients, and it'll just take the top layer. So if I have this like multi-point gradient on the top and I click that, it's going to bring that in here, and that's not really what I want. What I want is just to sample the color. So you do that in Illustrator by holding Shift, and then you can sample a specific color. So I'm kind of losing that a little bit with that darker color. Maybe I go brighter. That's a little bit too strong. That looks pretty good, right? It's showing up, but it still reads as the body color. And I'm going to do Effect Stylize Drop Shadow to kind of mock up a embossed feature and doing it pretty quickly in Illustrator. So the way you get this to look good, multiply black. And the way to get this to look good is to have small values on your offsets and blur. So the first thing to do is have your blur value pretty low. So I have 0.25. I think you could probably even do 0.5. And that's basically the spread of your shadow, the thickness that it's going to show up. Next, you have offset. So over here, -1 means you're offsetting actually up because it's a negative value. Let's see. If I go 5, yeah, that's offsetting down. So I actually want it to be, I think that looks pretty good, showing the shadow there. And then X, if you're a negative value, you're going left. Positive value, you're going right. That looks pretty good. Maybe a little bit bigger, so 1. And then the opacity is how intense the drop shadow is. For something molded like this, we actually don't want it to be too dark, so you could be pretty light here. And that looks like it's just slightly raised on the surface, right? That looks pretty good. You can do the same thing with a highlight if you wanted to do white and screen. but I think that's fine for this exercise. All right, so to finish up, I'm going to highlight all of these things and edit copy or Control C and go into Photoshop. And I'll start over here with a new document. So File, New. We'll go with letter size, portrait, because I have a taller container here. And go ahead and paste. You'll get this dialog box. The two ones that you want are Smart Object or Pixels. Pixels just takes the raw content. Smart Object keeps it as like a locked layer, which can be handy. But I'm going to use Pixels because it's already rasterized. That means that this image is available for me to work with and to erase and paint over. So I'm going to leave space for a second because you're going to be working on two for this project. So in Photoshop, we can create a layer and suggest a table that this is sitting on or a shelf by using the rectangular marquee to create field. And I go B on the keyboard or brush. And you can control the size of the brush by using the bracket keys on the keyboard or controlling it up here. And when working in Photoshop, I like to have really large brushes because there's better blending between them. So I have it kind of middle opacity, middle flow. That gives me a little bit more margin for error with this, and a very soft brush here. If I click on the outside here, hold Shift and click, it creates a straight line between those 2 points. So that gives me a nice table. If I wanted a little bit darker, I could just go ahead and do it again. And you can dial it in with the opacity. So something a little bit darker towards the horizon, a little bit lighter in the foreground will give you the illusion that this is sitting on a table. I can create a reflection by taking this object, right-clicking on the layer, and duplicating the layer. All right, so now I have a second one. If I go to Edit, Transform, Flip Vertical, it flips it upside down. I can drag that over here. And compress it. Oops. Got to zoom out a little bit more. Control T, and I'm holding Shift to compress it. And then with a big eraser, soft eraser, middle opacity and flow, I can begin to knock this back so that it looks like a reflection. Let's move that. All right, that looks pretty good. So if you guys want a simple studio environment, maybe like a solid color background and some text, like that could be fine, right? That could look really nice. You can play with gradients for the background, whether it's a radial gradient to create like a kind of silhouette or a vignetted effect, you can do that. Linear gradient as well, and that would look just fine. I want to show you guys a trick to bring a little AI into this. So we'll create ourselves a selection on, I suppose, a new layer. So here's our marquee. I'm going to make a new layer. And you'll see this come up here, this generative fill over here. Photoshop has a few different ways that they're bringing AI into the platform. This one's pretty handy. So this, if you hit generative fill, it gives you a text string where you can create a prompt. So this is kind of a handy way to create some kind of graphic background. So it'll scrub some images in its algorithm to respond to the prompt that you have. So for instance, if I did a floral pattern background and hit generate, it'll think for a second and give me some options based on that prompt. It'll also sample a little bit of what's in the file already. So let's see what it comes up with. Hey, that's getting a little bit better. I actually like that it faded out in the background there. That's kind of cool. That's the original, I think. So let's go with one of those first ones. Yeah, I kind of like that. They've centralized the pattern over the container. They've left this a little transparent, so that might be a nice kind of background for the second container, especially if it's a little lower. So that's kind of cool. I like that, so we'll keep that. And I actually want to suggest that in the reflection a little bit too. So let's duplicate this and duplicate. There we go. Edit, transform, flip vertical. Let's drag this down. And we want this to be behind our other reflection and compress it. Need to zoom out a little bit more. And let's make this quite a bit lighter. All right, that's not too bad because we've lowered the opacity of our reflection. I'm actually seeing a little bit of that through there. So rasterize that and then erase. And make that 100% eraser and just knock that back. All right, that looks pretty good. All right, so hopefully you've learned some useful techniques in Illustrator for using gradients and creating photorealistic renderings of your objects. Thanks for watching.